pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, castles kingside, pawn e5, knight e8, pawn f4, pawn d6, bishop e3, pawn c5, pawn takes c5, knight c6, pawn c5 takes d6, pawn takes d6, knight e4, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop e6, knight f3, queen c7, queen b1, pawn takes e5, pawn f5, pawn e4, pawn takes e6, pawn takes f3, pawn takes f3, pawn f5, pawn f4, knight f6, bishop e2, rook f8, e8, king f2, rook takes e6, rook e1, rook a8, e8, bishop f3, rook takes e3, rook takes e3, rook takes e3, king takes e3, queen takes f4, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, castles kingside, bishop g5, pawn d6, queen d2, pawn c5, pawn d5, pawn e6, bishop d3, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop e6, knight e2, bishop takes d5, pawn e4 takes d5, knight b8, d7, castles kingside, knight e5, pawn f4, Knight takes d3. Queen takes d3. Pawn h6. Bishop h4. Rook e8. Rook a1, e1. Queen b6. Bishop takes f6. Bishop takes f6. Pawn f5. Pawn g5. Pawn b3. Queen a5. Rook c1. Queen takes a2. Rook c2. Rook e3. Queen takes e3. Queen takes c2. King h1. Pawn a5. Pawn h4. Pawn a4. Pawn e4. Pawn e6. Pawn d4. Pawn d5. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Pawn e5. Pawn c5. Pawn a3. Bishop a5. Pawn b4. Pawn takes d4. Queen g4. Knight e7. Pawn takes a5. Pawn takes c3. Queen takes g7. Rook g8. Queen takes h7. Knight b8, c6. Knight f3. Queen c7. Bishop b5. Bishop d7. Castles kingside. Castles queenside. Bishop g5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes b5. Knight takes f7. Bishop takes f1. Knight takes d8. Rook takes g5. Knight takes e6. Rook takes g2. King h1. Queen e5. Rook takes f1. Queen takes e6. King takes g2. Queen g4. pawn e4, pawn e6, pawn d4, pawn d5, knight c3, bishop b4, pawn e5, pawn c5, pawn a3, bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, knight e7, pawn a4, queen c7, knight f3, pawn b6, bishop b5, bishop d7, bishop d3, knight b8, c6, castles kingside, pawn c4, bishop e2, pawn f6, bishop a3, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, rook e1, knight e7, c6, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, pawn f4, knight c6, bishop g4, castles queenside, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, rook d7, pawn f5, knight d8, rook e3, queen f4, rook f3, queen e4, pawn a5, knight c6, pawn takes b6, pawn takes b6, queen b1, king c7, bishop c1, queen e1, rook f1, queen takes c3, bishop f4, king b7, queen b5, pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, pawn f3, knight c6, pawn c4, pawn e6, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop e3, castles kingside, knight c2, pawn d5, pawn c4 takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, queen c7, queen b5, bishop d7, rook c1, knight b4, knight takes b4, queen takes c1, bishop takes c1, bishop takes b5, knight d5, bishop h4, pawn g3, bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, bishop d8, bishop d2, rook c8, bishop c3, pawn f5, pawn e5, rook c5, knight b4, bishop a5, pawn a3, bishop takes b4, pawn takes b4, rook d5, king e2, king f7, pawn h4, king e6, king e3, rook c8, rook g1, rook c4, rook e1, rook takes c3, pawn takes c3, rook takes e5, king d2, rook takes e1, king takes e1, king d5, king d2, king c4, pawn h5, pawn b6, king c2, pawn g5, pawn h6, pawn f4, pawn g4, pawn a5, pawn takes a5, pawn takes a5, king b2, pawn a4, king a3, king takes c3, king takes a4, king d4, king b4, king e3. pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, knight c6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, bishop e2, castles kingside, pawn f4, pawn d6, knight b3, bishop e6, pawn g4, pawn d5, pawn f5, bishop c8, pawn takes d5, knight b4, bishop f3, pawn takes f5, pawn a3, pawn takes g4, bishop g2, knight a6, queen d3, pawn e6, castles queenside, knight takes d5, pawn h3, pawn g3, rook h1, g1, queen d6, bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, king h8, bishop f4, queen g6, queen d2, bishop takes h3, rook takes g3, bishop g4, rook h1, rook f8, e8, knight e3, queen e4, queen h2, bishop e6, rook takes g7, king takes g7, queen h6, king g8, rook g1, queen g6, rook takes g6, pawn f7 takes g6, knight d4, rook a8, d8, bishop e5, rook d7, knight takes e6, rook takes e6, knight g4, rook f7, queen g5, rook f1, king d2, pawn h5, queen d8. pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6, knight c3, pawn d5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f3, pawn c5, pawn e3, knight c6, bishop d3, bishop e7, castles kingside, castles kingside, pawn a3, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, knight f6, bishop c2, pawn b6, queen d3, bishop b7, bishop g5, pawn g6, rook f1, e1, rook e8, pawn h4, rook c8, rook a1, c1, knight d5, knight e4, pawn f5, knight c3, bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, knight f4, queen e3, queen takes d4, knight b5, queen takes e3, pawn takes e3, knight takes g2, king takes g2, knight d4, bishop e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes b5, knight f6, king f7, knight takes e8, rook takes e8, pawn a4, knight d6, rook c7, king f6, rook e1, c1, pawn h6, rook takes a7, knight e4, rook a6, rook d8, rook c2, rook d3, rook takes b6, rook takes e3, pawn a5, pawn f4, rook f2, knight takes f2, king takes f2, rook e5, pawn b4, rook e3, pawn a6, rook a3, rook c6, pawn g5, pawn takes g5, pawn takes g5, pawn b5, pawn g4, rook c8, king f5, pawn b6, pawn g3, king e1, rook a1, king e2, pawn g2, rook f8, king e4, rook takes f4, king takes f4, pawn b7, pawn g1, pawn b8, king f5, queen f8, king e4, queen a8, king d4, queen d8, king c4, queen d3, king c5, queen c3, king d6, queen d2, king e5, queen b2, king f5, queen c2, king f6, queen b2, pawn e5, pawn c4, knight f6, pawn d4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, castles kingside, bishop e2, pawn d6, knight f3, pawn e5, castles kingside, knight c6, pawn d5, knight e7, knight e1, knight d7, knight d3, pawn f5, pawn takes f5, knight takes f5, pawn f3, knight d4, knight e4, pawn b6, bishop g5, queen e8, bishop d2, pawn a5, Rook e1. Knight takes e2. Queen takes e2. Pawn h6. Pawn b3. Pawn g5. Pawn a3. Queen g6. Pawn b4. Knight f6. Pawn takes a5. Pawn g4. Knight d3 f2. Pawn takes f3. Queen takes f3. Knight h5. Queen e3. Pawn takes a5. Rook a1, c1. Bishop f5. Pawn c5. Knight f4. Queen g3. Bishop takes e4. Rook takes e4. Queen takes e4. Knight takes e4. Knight e2. King h1. Knight takes g3. Pawn takes g3. Rook a6. Pawn takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Pawn a4. Rook f7. Pawn g4. Bishop f8. King h2. King h7. Rook c8. Rook b6. Rook a8. Rook b3. Bishop takes a5. Rook f4. Bishop c7. Rook takes e4. Rook takes f8. Rook d3. Rook f6. Rook takes g4. Rook takes d6. Rook g7. Rook c6. Rook takes d5. Rook c2. Pawn e4. Pawn a5. Rook d3. Bishop f4. Rook f7. Pawn g3. Pawn e3. Rook c1. Rook e7. Rook e1. Rook a3. Rook e2. King g6. King g2. Rook takes a5. Rook takes e3. Rook a2. King f3. Rook b7. Rook e6. King f5. Rook e5. King f6. Rook d5. Rook b3. King g4. Pawn e4. Pawn e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop b5. Pawn a6. Bishop a4. Pawn d6. Castles kingside. Bishop g4. Pawn h3. Bishop h5. Pawn c3. Queen f6. Pawn g4. Bishop g6. Pawn d4. Bishop takes e4. Knight b1, d2. Bishop g6. Bishop takes c6. Pawn takes c6. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop d6. Knight takes g6. Queen takes g6. Rook e1. King f8. Knight c4. Pawn h5. Knight takes d6. Pawn takes d6. Bishop f4. Pawn d5. Queen b3. Pawn takes g4. Queen b7. Pawn takes h3. Bishop g3. Rook d8. Queen b4. Knight e7. Queen takes e7. King g8. Queen takes d8. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Knight f3. Castles kingside. Bishop e2. Pawn e5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Pawn d5. Knight e7. Knight e1. Knight d7. Knight d3. Pawn f5. Pawn takes f5. Knight takes f5. Pawn f3. Knight f6. Knight f2. Knight d4. Knight f2 e4. Knight h5. Bishop g5. Queen d7. Pawn g3. Pawn h6. Bishop e3. Pawn c5. Bishop takes d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Knight b5. Pawn a6. Knight b5 takes d6. Pawn d3. Queen takes d3. Bishop d4. King g2. Knight takes g3. Knight takes c8. Knight takes f1. Knight b6. Queen c7. Rook takes f1. Queen takes b6. Pawn b4. Queen takes b4. Rook b1. Queen a5. Knight takes c5. Queen takes c5. Queen takes g6. Bishop g7. Rook takes b7. Queen d4. Bishop d3. Rook f4. Queen e6. King h8. Queen g6.